Hi there, my name is Frank Sandor, author of Magyar Origins. When I was researching my book, I stumbled across a discovery which possibly has huge implications both linguistically and anthropologically, and that specifically is the origins of all Uralic-speaking peoples. The traditional view is that there is a Western migration of Uralic speakers out of Asia into Europe, and that included the Mansi, the Estonians, and the Finns, and several other languages as well. And the belief was that Hungarian, being an Uralic language, was also part of this Western migration. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, researchers in Southern California discovered a previously unknown genetic marker, and that marker was M178 and TAT. While they were doing their aliotyping, they discovered this marker that traced that Western migration across Europe of the Uralic speakers. And what they found was that Hungarians did not contain this marker. So what that means is that there was in fact a migration of Uralic speakers from the east to the west. But Hungarians were not part of that migration. At no time in their history have they ever spent any extended period in Northern Asia or Northern Europe. Because if they would have interbred with the other Uralic speakers and obtained that marker. And that marker is at least 4,000 years old. So that raised an interesting question. If Hungarians were not part of this Western migration of Uralic speakers, then where did they come from? So I looked at the genetic types. Majority of Hungarians belong to a haplogroup called R1A1A, and the parent group R1A1, geneticists say, is a south originating gene. And then I looked at the distributions of R1A1A. In Hungary, that distribution is about 60%. The surrounding countries are much less. You've got Poland, which is only 50%, Ukraine, which is only 50%, part of Western Russia, which is only 50%, Romania, which is way down to 20%, and that includes factoring in the non-Hungarian majority. Same with the Urals, they're down between 10 and 20%. Pardon, the Caucasus are down to 10-20%. The Ural region is either down to 20% or even non-existent. Siberia is non-existent. The only place in the whole world that you would find a genetic haplogroup with the same concentration or higher of the Hungarians is all the way down in South Asia. And that's in the regions of southern Pakistan and northern India. And they're up at about 70% or higher. And that's what you would expect to find if you're looking for a parent group for such a large concentration. If such a large concentration would have came from, say, Western Russia, then you would have literally a hole in this map of distribution. You wouldn't have lower amounts spreading out and then settling into higher amounts. You would have, say, a Ukraine of 50%, a Western Russia of much lower, and then beside it much higher, given that a whole large population got moved. So what you would expect to find is that the Hungarians are actually a representative sample of where they came from, not a big geographic block getting up and relocating. And the only place that allows for a geographic sample of 60% or higher is southern Pakistan or India. So what does that mean? We've got a Western migration of Uralic speakers going out of Asia and into Western Europe. And then we've got Hungarians coming from here. That created a conundrum. If Hungarians are down here and the Uralic speakers are up here, how did they get together and what happened? So I decided to look further at this DNA evidence that said Hungarians came from southern Pakistan or northern India. In order to explain how this happened, I had to find the parent language. And I looked at different languages. I looked at Altaic languages, but the fact is that the most dominant language in this region is Sanskrit. And it's the most influential for all the nearby languages. So if the Uralic speakers came from this region, then Sanskrit was probably also the most influential language for the Uralic languages as well. And when we look at Hungarian and we look at Sanskrit, we do find some surface similarities. Hungarian word for hunter, vadas. The Sanskrit word for hunter is vadha. The Hungarian word for hoe is kappa. The Sanskrit word for hoe is kappa. But that's only a small percentage of words that have been directly adopted from Sanskrit into Hungarian. And what's happened in the past is that people have noticed a connection and a similarity between Hungarian and Sanskrit, and they've run into this roadblock. It's only a few words. They've tried to say, well, the languages are possibly related. And because they couldn't get past that surface similarity, any research they did was laughed at and disregarded. I didn't accept that that was the end of the road. All the clues pointed to South Asia. To just kind of throw that away, to me, seemed wrong. The languages obviously had a direct adaptation of words. Therefore, Hungarians did have direct contact with Sanskrit speakers. You couldn't have that many words being directly adopted and never having contact with Sanskrit speakers. And it would have to be a heavy influence from Sanskrit in order to adopt the number of words that they did. And the DNA evidence says they came from a region of Sanskrit speakers. So I pondered this and I figured there has to be something more to this. If Hungarians adopted the word for dog, which is very similar to the word for, or the Hindi word for dog, why not the other words? And then it occurred to me that Hungarians and the other Uralic speakers are not genetic descendants of Sanskrit speakers. If you look at Sanskrit speakers and you look at the Uralic speakers, there is a distinct skin difference. You can tell that they're not genetically related. Well, if they're not genetically related, they're not bound to adopting the entire language and passing that down to their children over time and having the gradual sound changes. Instead, what appears to have happened is the Uralic speakers, thousands and thousands of years ago, moved into that region. And what I realized was that they adopted the Sanskrit words, not usually on this word for that and for that object, but instead the qualities and the observational characteristics of the object. So the Hungarian is based on observation, not imitation. And it's based on observed qualities. For example, the Hungarian word for father, apa, is not derived from the Sanskrit word for father, which is janika. Instead, they looked at what a father does. A father sows his seed. And the Hungarian word for father, apa, is from the Sanskrit word to sow his seed, vapa. And then that got me going. I started looking at more words. The Hungarian word for burn, agni, is not from the Sanskrit word for burn. It's from the Sanskrit word for fire, agni. The Hungarian word for shovel, kanal, is not from the Sanskrit word for shovel. It's from the Sanskrit word for dig, kana. The Hungarian word for tail, farka, is not from the Sanskrit word for tail. It's from the Sanskrit word for wolf, varka. And that itself carries over through Hungarian, with the Hungarian word for wolf being an extension of the Hungarian word for tail. The Hungarian word for wheelbarrow, or the archaic Hungarian word for wheelbarrow, taliga, is from the Sanskrit word for a small cart, talika. So we had a lot of words that I found that were in fact based on observational qualities. And once I realized this, it started opening up the whole language to me, and I started thinking, well, these word adoptions cannot be random. There has to be rules that these word adoptions follow. And so I sat down and I worked out what are these rules. Well, first, the rules are that only occasionally are Sanskrit words directly adopted into Hungarian. Usually, the Sanskrit words are adopted based on their observational qualities, as I've already said. But then I also noticed that the words are also reduced. You can have a 6-syllable Sanskrit word, and that 6-syllable Sanskrit word is not adopted into Hungarian. It's reduced to 2 or even maybe 1 syllable. Then there's a reuse factor that I noticed that was happening. The Hungarian language would reuse those adopted Sanskrit words whenever possible to describe something. The Hungarian language is trying to protect itself. It doesn't want foreign words included. So whenever they encountered a new object, those observational qualities would be derived from words they had already previously adopted. Only when they're lacking that a word that described that new characteristic did they go and adopt another foreign word. So you can have a 6 or an 8-syllable Hungarian word, but what it is actually a recombination of 3 or 4 other words. So a Hungarian word that has 5 or 6 syllables is actually a sentence. And then what I noticed was the words' sounds also tended to soften over time. The most common sound change I found was that A's frequently became an O sound or were dropped altogether. G's frequently moved to the end of the word or were dropped altogether. So knowing these rules, I looked at the whole Hungarian language, and basically everything opened before me. It was amazing. It took about a week for it to sink in, but once it did, it felt like I discovered the unified field theory of physics, because from that point on, there were no more unanswered questions. There was no looking at a Hungarian word and saying, oh, that kind of sounds like a Turkish word, but then having no explanation for those word variations in Finnish or Estonian. What I had discovered explained those word variations. So based on that, I realized, well, why can't I start predicting where to find the word definitions, or the word origins? And so the Hungarian words for wheelbarrow, taliska and taliga, they're 3-syllable words. That in itself is a clue that they're actually compound words, because they exceed that 2-syllable trend that I had noticed. And so I looked at, well, what is a wheelbarrow? A wheelbarrow is a small cart with a box or a cavity. So then I looked back at Sanskrit, and I realized that taliga was actually talika plus kappa, which would be the Sanskrit words for talika, a small cart, kappa, with a cavity or well. Talika became tali or talich, and kappa became ka or ga. The Hungarian word for fire, tuz, sounds like the Sanskrit word for fire, uzij. They both have that uz sound in them. But as I said before, words are rarely adopted directly. So I didn't want to jump the gun and say, well, that's where the word came from, because I had to confirm, well, does it explain the other variations within all the Uralic languages? Because the other variations of the Uralic languages for the word fire do not contain that Z sound. They do contain the TU sound. Hungarian tuz, the Estonian tulip, the Finnish tuli. So whatever the source word was for tuz had to explain all of those variations, not just Hungarian. And that's the mistake that a lot of people make when they say, well, this Hungarian word originated in Turkic. They explain the similar sounding word, but then they forget that there's all those other Uralic words from other languages that are just sound changes or different variations that Turkic word has no possibility of explaining. So what does a fire look like, or what does a flame look like? And you realize, well, one of the things a flame looks like, it looks like a paintbrush. They both have that bulbous base coming to a very fine point. If you dip a paintbrush in a red or a yellow paint, the resemblance to a flame is quite similar. And the word tuz is actually from the Sanskrit word for tulika. And that's verified by the other Uralic languages, variations of the word fire. Tulica became tus. In Estonian, they almost maintain that word completely unchanged with the tulica hu. And same with Finnish, is they just dropped the end syllable and kept it as tuli. What else looks like a paintbrush, I thought? Well, a tulip could also look like a paintbrush or a flame. It also has that base that comes to a point. A tulip also has that lighter white color, just like a paintbrush when you dip it in paint. It's got a lighter white color at the base and the more brilliant color as it goes to the tip. The difference between a tulip and a flame or a paintbrush is it's made from leaves. So when I went back and I looked at what the possible origin of the Hungarian word for tulip, which is tulipan, and I realized, well, tulipan is also more than 2 syllables. That was a hint. It's a compound word. It's not a single adopted word. So I took the hint that it's a compound word, and I looked at the properties of a tulip. It looks like a flame or a paintbrush, but it's made from leaves. So we took the Sanskrit word for paintbrush, which is tulika, and then we took the Sanskrit word for consisting of leaves, which is parna. Tulika dropped the final syllable, shortened it to 2 syllables, became tuli. Parna dropped the final A and softened the middle AR, making that down to a single syllable, making pan. So tulika and parna became tuli plus pan, or tulipan, which means, literally, a paintbrush consisting of leaves. And there's more verification for this by, once again, going back to the Uralic languages and noticing that the Estonian word for buttercup is tulika, with an S on the end. And that's the thing, is that whatever rule you come up with to define, well, this word came from that and that word came from this, has to explain all the related languages. It can be not, and no rule can exist in isolation. So could these rules be applied to find the origins of the word Magyar itself? I needed a starting point, and so with nobody having any idea of what Magyar even means, that became much more difficult to find out where Magyar might have come from. So first I had to determine what is the most probable meaning of Magyar. And so I did a statistical analysis, and I found that of the archaic words, over 50% of archaic words that start with that ma sound are agricultural references. So the logical conclusion was that Magyar, being a ma prefixed word, is also an agricultural reference. So I then looked for, within Hungarian, I looked for similar sounding words to Magyar. Major, which is a small croft or farm. Jarma is Magyar with just the 2 syllables reversed. And Jarma is a colony or plantation, or basically a producer of agriculture. So we've got similar sounding Hungarian words. Statistically, Magyar is a agricultural reference. And if Jarma means producer of agriculture, and we reverse those, then Magyar most likely means an agricultural producer. So I took that starting point, and then I went to Sanskrit. And there's this really big long word, I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce it, and it's a Sanskrit word that means for someone who farms for himself and somebody else. And so then I applied the laws to that. And I shortened that long Sanskrit word to 2 syllables. Just like I said before, you could have a 6-syllable word, but only 2 or maybe 1 syllables actually adopted into Hungarian. This really big long word dropped its middle syllable and 2 syllables and became Magyar. Both of those words are agricultural references. So, if correct, then that really long Sanskrit word must also explain all the other variations of that word in the Uralic languages, Estonian and Finnish, etc. So the Hungarian word magyar or major, which means farm, was adopted, taking the magyar and the r as their two syllables. Estonian, majand, did the exact same adoption, except instead of adopting the r, it adopted the m, and over time changed that to an n. Finnish, matila. This is one of the things that makes me think I am correct in that this is the source word for magyar, because they adopted the ma and the extra a's, and then they took the n syllable, which is different than what Finnish and Finnish and Hungarian had done. So whatever the source word is for the Hungarian, the Estonian, and the Finnish words for farm, it has to contain the mud syllable, it has to contain an R or similar sounding syllable, it has to contain an M or similar sounding syllable, and it has to have a taka syllable in it. And this Sanskrit word meets all of those requirements. And so this is a hint that all three of these languages are not from a single parent language that changed over time, but instead the Uralic languages are a group of, or multiple groups of people who lived in close proximity to each other, but they adopted this Sanskrit in just slightly different ways. So then I went back, so I took those rules and I figured, okay, well, there's a good probability here that Sanskrit is the originating language of Hungarian and all the Uralic languages. And so I went back and I looked at the Hungarian legend of the deer or the legend of the stag, which is the legend that explains how Hungarians got from Persia to Europe. And today it's described as the Hungarians followed a deer or a stag. Some say it was a brilliant glowing deer, brilliant white deer, and they followed that stag through a forest or a meadow. But that's not what the original legend was. The oldest recorded version of that legend in Latin says that it was a deer and that they followed that deer through a desert. Later translations tried to explain, well, why would they follow a deer through a desert? There's no deer in the desert. So they would incorporate the words forest or meadow or anything that would kind of help explain it to a mind that did have no understanding of where that legend actually came from. But I took the Sanskrit literary rules and I applied it to the oldest Latin version. And in Sanskrit, it is a normal and accepted practice to replace the word for moon with the word for deer. And that's because the moon has all these little dots on it, and the moon's called deer marked. And once you do that, then the legend of the deer suddenly becomes a roadmap of where the Hungarians traveled. So when we replace the word deer with the word moon, we have the Hungarians leaving southern India, northern Pakistan, the eastern end of Persia, and they're leaving and they're following the desert. Right here, there's a large desert directly to the east of Persia, which is follow the moon and you will find this desert. So they followed the Tian Shan Mountains and the desert, and they followed that east. And then the legend says, in the land of the people that caused them to go west, they turned and they no longer saw that deer again. And that's because they're now heading west. The moon is behind them. So we have the Hungarians traveling up, heading east past the desert, around the mountains, now taking a sharp turn west, never seeing that moon again. Now, that also means that the other Uralic speakers at one time would have had to, if over 4,000 years ago, would have had to have been down in Pakistan and northern India in order for them to also have those Sanskrit characteristics. And over 4,000 years ago, for different reasons, those different groups broke off and left, Hungarians being the last of them. I hope you have enjoyed what I've had to say today. My book, Hungarian Origins, is not just about the possibility of Sanskrit being the original language for all Uralic-speaking peoples. The book is actually about the myths that have evolved over about Hungarian origins. And I trace the origins of those myths, where those myths actually came from. And then I talk about, well, if those myths came from here, how do they evolve and what are they today? And then if they are myths, what is the most probable explanation for the circumstance that became a myth? But that was the fact that I discovered that the Uralic speakers are possibly a form of Sanskrit slang almost, was something I just felt I should share with everybody, even if they don't want to buy my book. So I hope you've enjoyed what I've said today, and thank you for listening.